Gene. Thanks for coming. Nice man. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Cyber Policy Center seminar for today. Before I get to our very exciting guest this afternoon, I wanted to recognize one of the Cyber Policy staff, Michelle Poulin, who just had her birthday, and so we also want to recognize that she's been at Stanford for more than 15 years, an amazing and dedicated person for which the Cyber Policy Center wouldn't work without. So please join me in thanking Michelle for her amazing service at Stanford. And happy birthday! Happy birthday! Thank you, everybody. So today I'm delighted to introduce Talia Stroud and Josh Tucker, two not only leading scholars in social media research, but also the lead academic principals on the Facebook studies that we've already talked a little bit about in the seminar earlier this year with Jen, Neil, and Pablo. And today, Talia and Josh will give us another level analysis looking across the studies. As usual, we'll have a moderated discussion afterwards, so those of you online, please send in your questions. And we'll have Talia will go first, followed by Josh, and then I'll join them for the discussion. Talia.
Thank you so much. We're really just so delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share the research that we've been working on. Folks in the back, can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So just to begin, I'm Talia Stroud. This is my co-chair of this effort, Josh Tucker. It's been a real pleasure to work with him on this project. Today, what we're going to do is give you an overview of the 4 studies that have been published thus far, and hopefully give a little bit of insight in terms of how this project came to be. And to begin, I want to first acknowledge that although Josh and I will be speaking today, this was a massive effort with lots and lots of different collaborators and people who were involved across both academia and at Meta. We have some of them here today. I don't mean to call them out, but if they want to give a little wave that they're here, please feel welcome. So thank you so much for being here. And this really has been just an incredible endeavor to work with so many people, from engineers within Meta to academics and all different academic disciplines. So to begin with, what we'd like to do today is tell you a little bit about the nature of the collaboration with Meta, talk a bit about the research design for the projects overall, then turn to some results about the on-platform experience. I'll then turn it over to Josh, who will share some of our results about polarization, and then we'll talk about what we can and cannot conclude. We're only going to scratch the surface of these papers today, but hopefully we'll give you some insight across these 4 papers, some of the things that we're learning, and just urge you so much to look at the full papers and dive into the supplemental appendices, all of those good things. Okay, so to begin with collaborating with Meta, so the partnership began in early 2020, and the project team consisted of 17 academic researchers, and we came together to design the overall project. And then the academic team, we added additional collaborators over time to fill specific needs on paper, so specific types of analyses that we needed an expert in. We brought additional academics on the project. We worked with NORC out of the University of Chicago to gather all of the data for the project. And the scope of this project really was the role and impact of Facebook and Instagram in the context of the US 2020 election. So you'll note that all of our research questions and papers are confined to questions that are specific to this context. We have a lot more details about exactly the nature of the project and how it came to be in a publicly posted FAQ. It's on Medium. You can search for some subset of these findings if you'd like to read more about that. Because we were going to be working with a company that we were also studying, which is an interesting position to be in, we began the project by really trying to be very thoughtful about how we would go about doing this research. What sort of guardrails would we put into place? How could we do what we thought was best at the beginning of the project to demonstrate the integrity of what we were about to do? So let me share a couple of those with you. The first is that we pre-registered the studies. So prior to getting any data, we actually pre-specified our hypotheses, the analyses that we were going to do, and we uploaded these date-stamped and time-stamped to a pre-registration website. We used OSF. And this was so that before there was any data, before we knew what the results were, we had agreed upon exactly what we were going to do, and that all of those results would be presented publicly once we had the data in hand. The second was before we began this study, we were very adamant that there had to be an agreement that there would be no pre-publication approval, that it couldn't be the case that if the results came back in a way that reflected poorly on Meta, that Meta could say, nope, you aren't permitted to publish these. So that was an agreement that we reached with Meta prior to embarking upon this endeavor. The exceptions here were that Meta retained the ability to look over the research that we were doing in terms of making sure that it abided by the privacy obligations that Meta had to its users. Second, that it abided by the legal obligations that Meta has. And then third, that the designs that we proposed were feasible. Because we began this study in early 2020, there were some time constraints in terms of what we could actually propose. And if we proposed something that was going to take like $1 billion for us to do, obviously that wasn't going to be within the scope of this project. We also set it up so that each of the papers have academic lead authors with control rights. So members of the external academic team serve as lead authors on the paper, and they have control rights, by which we mean if there was any discrepancy or any disagreement between authors, whether it was meta authors or other academic authors, these were the people at the end of the day that could say, no, this is what's going to go in the paper, and this is what we're agreeing upon in terms of the final form of the paper. So it was a bit of a decision-making criterion that we put in place to ensure the integrity of these studies and to ensure that the academics did have the final word on what was presented in the papers. The next integrity provision we put in place was to have a project rapporteur. So this was an interesting component of this project because not only were we studying other people, but we also were being studied at the same time. So we had Mike Wagner, who's a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, serve as an ethnographer of the project. So he would attend many of the meetings that we had. He would review the notes. And then his role was to figure out, how is this working? How are things working between Meta and between the external academic researchers? And having a rapporteur in place also was there to incentivize good behavior on the part of all of the people that were taking part in it. His work has also been published as part of this. Encourage you to read through that if it's of interest. And then the final thing is that the data for published papers are publicly available for replication and extension. They're available through the University of Michigan's ICPSR, this SOMAR right here, where you can apply to work with the data. So we urge everyone in the room that has an interest in this to do so because we really only scratched the surface of all the analyses that could be done with these data. The process by which the paper topics were chosen is important to be very clear about. So the first step we did was to identify the key constructs of interest. And here we were thinking about what's scientifically interesting right now, what do we anticipate is going to happen in the 2020 election, and where are there really unresolved debates, both publicly and in the academic research, about what social media's role might happen to be. And so we settled upon 4 key variables that we would examine throughout the studies. The first is political polarization. The second is political participation. This includes both turnout and vote choice. The fourth is dismiss information, whatever combination they're in, how knowledgeable people were about the events that were taking place in 2020, and their perceptions and misperceptions of what was occurring. The final category was attitudes and beliefs about democratic norms, which of course turned out to be quite an important variable for us to include. We then divided up our team into different groups that were figuring out exactly what research designs we were going to put into place, and this was a collaboration among the meta researchers and the academic researchers. And so we have some studies that are purely experimental, where we were altering what was happening on the platforms. I'll say more about that in a moment. We had other studies that were observational, so we were looking at US adults 18 plus on the platform to understand what happens at the level of the entire platform. And then we had some studies that are combinations of the two to give context to the causal effects, at the same time showcasing what was happening overall on the platforms. The first 4 papers were published this summer in Science and Nature. The ones that we'll be discussing today look at manipulations to the algorithm to understand what the consequences were on both people's exposure on the feed and their attitudes. And then we also had an observational study that was looking at ideological segregation on the platform. We'll say more about all of these shortly. So for the research design, the observational studies that we'll be talking about today and that are included in the published papers, the first is looking at ideological segregation in exposure to political news. And by way of preview, we look at this in 2 really important ways. The first is looking at segregation So we're examining how ideologically segregated the audience is, with higher scores, meaning that they're more segregated. And then we also look at favorability, which is looking at the political composition of the audience for news URLs. 0 would mean perfectly balanced, that it has an equal mix of those that lean to the left and the right. Negative scores indicate more liberal audiences, and positive scores indicate more conservative audiences. This paper was authored by Gonzalez-Bayón et al. In the Nyhan et al. Paper, we were looking at like-minded exposure, and so here the observational units are understanding how often people are exposed to ideological content from like-minded sources, be that a like-minded user, a page where the majority of people who are following that page share the individual's ideology, or a group of the same nature. We complement that with experimental treatments, and this was a really exciting component of the project because there are so many debates about what was going to happen if we altered the algorithm in some way. What would the consequence of that be? So this was an opportunity to actually test that in a real-world environment, which was such an incredible opportunity, not only for the scientific components of it, but also because many of the things that we were testing have been publicly proposed as ways the algorithms should change. And so this is actually evaluating what would happen if we implemented some of these popularly proposed solutions to what's happening with social media or what's happening to democracy more generally. And so we try to hit upon 3 of the big ways in which algorithmic changes have been proposed, both theoretically and popularly. First is just altering the algorithm. So what happens if you actually switch to a chronological feed where the information is just displayed as the most recent content rather than anything that's ranked based on the engagement ranking algorithm? The second one was to really rethink virality. And so here we removed access, or we reduced access to reshared content in people's feeds, so they were less likely to see content that had been reshared. And the third is really tackling echo chambers. So what happens if we reduce the amount of content in people's feed from politically like-minded sources? What we did with the experiment was we recruited people, US 18 plus, monthly active users in English and Spanish. For consenting participants, they were informed that their platform experiences might change. The treatments lasted approximately 3 months, and roughly we have around 6K per treatment and 14K in the control, although there's some variability. And people were recruited on their feeds, so they would see they call it a QP, but they would see a little announcement at the top of their feed that would say, would you like to be involved in the study? And then they would go through a consent process that would inform them of what the study could involve. The data that we collected, first we collected panel survey responses. So we had 6 waves of panel surveys beginning prior to the election, following the election, and then we added an additional wave following the events that happened in January. For all participants that took part in this, they consented to allowing us to have access to their Facebook and or Instagram log data. And we also had, for the observational studies, aggregated data for Facebook and Instagram so we could understand what was happening at the platform overall. In addition to this, we had passive browser and app usage tracking. So we'll mention this just a little bit in the presentation today. And then the other 2 we won't mention today, but we also collected data for participants who agreed to share this data with us about their voter files and FEC contributions, in addition to their Twitter handles and what they had posted to Twitter during this time period. So let me share now a bit about the results across these studies in terms of on-platform experiences and what really happened on the platform. So to begin with, one thing that we note is that algorithmic changes really affect the mix of content that people see. And while the percentage change might not, the absolute change might not be that large, the relative changes are pretty significant. And when we switch users to the chronological news feed, so this is where they're seeing everything in order of what's been posted most recently, users see more political content. They see both more political content and more political news. We only have the ability to analyze exposure to like-minded and cross-cutting content on Facebook, which is why you don't see these same results for Instagram. But if we look at Facebook, when people are switched to this chronological feed, they get less content from cross-cutting and from like-minded sources. So less partisan content, you could think of it that way, and more content from moderate or mixed sources. So we say moderate or mixed because these could be sources that just appeal to those people without strong partisan attachments, at least based on the classifier that we used. This also could be sites or pages or groups where people from both sides of the aisle are in the audience. So less partisan content, more moderate or mixed sources. When you switch to the chronological feed, people are seeing more content from untrustworthy sources. And then the last one demonstrates that Facebook and Instagram algorithms are different in some ways, because when we switched to the chronological feed for Facebook, there was less uncivil content and content with slur words, and it was the opposite, although small effects, for Instagram. So this, I think, demonstrates that there are really important changes that happen to the content that people see when you change the algorithm. And the other interesting thing to note is that I would have a hard time painting a uniformly positive or negative normative take on what these results mean. So you might say, oh, it's great, people are exposed to more political content, but at the same time, oh, wow, people are also more exposed to untrustworthy sources. So it's a mixed bag. And I think that this is a bit of a theme that you'll see across this, that simple solutions like, oh, let's just turn off the algorithm, it has lots of effects in terms of what sort of content people are seeing, and not all of them may be normatively evaluated positively. When we change the mix of content that people see by blocking the reshared content, we again see changes to what they see, except for here, it's in the opposite direction from what we saw with chronological feed. So when reshared content is blocked, Facebook users see less political content. They see less content from cross-cutting and like-minded sources and more content from moderate and mixed sources. So you might think of this as they're seeing more news, more political content. They see less content from untrustworthy sources, and they see more uncivil content. So all of this is to make the argument that algorithmic changes, whether it's changing reshares, whether it's changing chronological feed, and I'm not going to show it here, but if you look in the like-minded papers there too, it changes the mix of content that people see. And we're able to demonstrate that for the classifiers that we have in place, but there are probably lots of other things that change as a result of these sorts of changes to the algorithm. Algorithmic changes also affect how people spend their time. So you've heard lots of discussion about, oh, the algorithms on some of these platforms are designed to increase engagement or designed to affect how people spend their time. And in fact, when we switch Facebook and Instagram to a chronological feed, it does change how much time people spend on the platform. So unlike the ranked feed, people spend less time on these platforms when it switches to a chronological news feed. And then they substitute that with changing their behavior on other platforms. So for a subset of the participants, they agreed to allow us to have their internet browsing data so that we could actually analyze where did they go outside of the Facebook or Instagram platform as a consequence of these changes to the algorithm. And what we find is that when they're spending less time on Facebook, users on mobile devices are spending more time on Instagram. On browsers, they're spending more time on YouTube and on Reddit. And for Instagram, they're increasingly going to YouTube and TikTok. So there's some interesting substitution effects that you see taking place when the algorithm is changed to a chronological feed. The other, and the third final point I want to make about algorithms, so in addition to saying that algorithms change the content that people see, two, algorithms change the way that people spend their time. The third is that algorithmic changes affect how people engage. So people actually engage differently depending on the makeup of their algorithm. So here I'm showing results from our like-minded study, where again we demoted content from like-minded groups, pages, and other users. And when we do so, we find that people engage less with content from like-minded sources and misinformation repeat offenders. And they also see less of this content, so in some ways this is kind of expected, right? If you demote like-minded content, obviously, or we might think that's pretty obvious that they're engaging less with like-minded content. It also turns out when you demote like-minded content, you actually reduce views on misinformation repeat offenders, and you reduce engagement on it as well. But the interesting question with engagement is not so much did you reduce the absolute levels of engagement, but what happens if you look at the rate of engagement? And so here, I think it's really interesting because when people see content from like-minded sources, So given that they saw it, even though it was demoted, what happens? Given that they saw it, they're in fact more likely to engage with it when it's been demoted. So it's almost as though, and I'm definitely putting a psychological spin on this that's not in our data, but it's almost as though people are like, oh, I really wanted that. Let me engage even more than I would have otherwise, given that it's not appearing in my feed at the same rate that it would have been. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a feel for the results across these studies and demonstrates to you that these changes to the algorithm really do have an effect on people's on-platform experiences. And I'm now going to turn it over to Josh to share some of our results about polarization.
Great. Thanks, Talia, and thanks to Jeff and the Cyber Policy Center for having us here today, and thanks for all of you for coming out today. As Talia had said earlier on, we had 4 big picture questions that we wanted to get at in this study, and one of them was the impact of these platforms on polarization in the context of the election. So, as Talia mentioned, these pages, as she undersold it a little bit, these are papers that have like 200-page appendices, supplemental appendices, all of them. So one of the things that we're trying to do here is just think about findings that we can talk that cut across all the papers. So I'm going to spend the rest of this time talking to you about the results we found in terms of polarization. All right, so to reiterate, we have the nice thing about polarization, we have conclusions we can get to this from all 4 of the papers, and we have 2 of the papers that look at observational research design. So I'm going to start there. So just to remind you again before we go into this, what was happening with these 2 papers is that in the Gonzalez and Bayon et al. Paper, we were looking at the levels of ideological segregation in exposure to news. So to be very clear here, the unit of analysis in this study is going to be the link. It's the news story itself. And what we're going to look at is the extent to which that audience is primarily liberal, primarily conservative, or a mix of both. That's going to tell us one thing about polarization on the platform from an ideological standpoint. The other thing in the second paper we're going to look at is exposure to content from politically like-minded sources. So just to reiterate, that was Talia was talking about a second ago about the experiment that we did there. But we also, in that Nyhan et al. Paper, this was the one that came out in Nature, we have this observational data on how much exposure people are getting to content from politically like-minded sources. And before I show that, I just want to reiterate, we're not talking about exposure to politically like-minded content. The question is here, and we'll get into this in a second, and I'll show you this. The point is here, we're talking about content that comes from politically like-minded sources. So if I'm conservative, if I'm seeing content that's posted by conservative friends of mine, pages, or groups, that would be politically like-minded content. I'll show you some interesting findings about how much of that is actually political. All right. Okay, so let's start with the first result we can show from this, which is ideological segregation and exposure to news. Now, Talia told you about the measure that's being used here, which is our segregation index here. And the key thing to know about this is that in past research that looked at browsing behavior, so when people were left to their own devices, how much ideological segregation did we see from browser behavior studies? It was about a 0.10 level. So what we find is when we turn to Facebook that these levels of ideological segregation are significantly higher than we found when people are sort of left to their own devices. So if you think of, you can live in an environment of the entire web, there is ideological segregation and exposure to news, but once you walk into a platform, in this particular case, Facebook, the platform, this one pushes up the level of ideological segregation off of what we see when people are out on their own on the World Wide Web. So what we're showing here is 2 things which are going to be important in a second when I show you the next chart, is that we measure this in a couple different ways. We measure ideological segregation at the level of the domain. That's the lower level of ideological segregation, although still much higher than we see in browsing behavior. And then we measure it at the level of the actual URLs. So this is simply just an aggregation exercise here, right? A bunch of URLs aggregate up to be all the URLs from those domains. So one way to think about this is there's more ideological segregation on Facebook in who is being exposed to particular CNN news stories than there is when you aggregate up to all of CNN news stories. Okay, so first finding, high degree of segregation. The second finding is that we can look at different aspects, where we encounter different aspects of segregation. So if you think about this, there's kind of like 3 levels that we are able to look at this here, and we were able to do all 3 of these in this study. The first is what we call the potential content you could see. So at the time we were doing this study, pretty much everything that appeared in your feed, independent of it, except for ads, was friends of yours, the content they posted, groups you had joined, content they posted, and pages you followed, content they posted. So you could imagine that's the potential content. How much segregation is there in the potential content that you could see across everything that's being posted by everybody you're following or friends with? That's the yellow line on both of these charts. Then there's the content that actually appears in your feed. This is 100% the algorithm. This is literally the secret sauce of everything. It's that how do you go from the potential content you could get to what shows up when you take out your phone, when you log on your laptop. So that's the effect of the algorithm as we go from potential to what you actually see. Then there's a third step when we go from what you see to what you engage with. So this is the social aspect of it. This is the human aspect. This is what human beings are choosing to do, conditional on what they see, which is conditional on what they could have seen. And so the second big takeaway here is that especially when we look at domains, segregation increases when we go from potential exposure to what you are actually exposed to what you engaged with. When we look at the actual URLs, we see that it goes potential and exposed are pretty similar to each other, and then it gets more segregation when you get engaged. There has been a bunch, for anyone who's followed the discussions online about this, there's been a bunch of discussion and pushback of questions about which of this should be attributed to algorithms, what do we take about this by attributing to humans? Our takeaway is that it's a complex interaction between the two. You can look at the URLs and say, well, it doesn't seem like the algorithm is doing that much. It's really just at the level of what people are engaging with. But when you look at the domains, it's a different picture. But also, what's gotten lost in the shuffle in all this is that the inventory, which we would think of, the potential exposure, you would think of that, oh, that's human choice. Who did I choose to be friends with? Who did I choose to follow? Except that's also a function of who the platform recommends that I follow and recommends that I see. So even at that first level, there's this complex interaction there. Okay, next up, we're going to turn to like-minded sources. So in like-minded sources, in this paper, observationally, what we're looking at here is the extent to which what proportion of your content that you see comes from people who are politically similar to you, people politically dissimilar to you, or from moderates. This is what's cool about this paper is that because we have the entire platform, we're able to actually have these cumulative distribution functions here, which actually show what proportion of people on the platform see things at different levels. But I'm going to not make you figure out the key thing from looking at those graphs. And what I'm going to tell you is the key takeaways from this, which is first, the median Facebook user received a majority of their content from politically like-minded sources. And it was a lot more than they saw from cross-cutting sources. So about 50% they get from like-minded sources, but only about 15% from cross-cutting sources. However, and this is where we come back to the content part of it, according to the classifiers we use, which were designed to classify things that had civic content to them, that were about politics, that's actually political information and news is actually only a small percentage of that content. So it's like about 7% of the content is political content and about 7% of it is news. Now the reason we took all of the content is one of the co-authors on this project is Jamie Settle, and she has read this book about all the sorts of subtle signals you can get. The idea that like if I say, hey, I drove my electric vehicle to the farmer's market, right? That has a sort of subtle cue to it as well that might not be picked up by a politics classifier. But it is important to remember that when we say they're getting the majority of their content from politically like-minded sources, that doesn't mean the majority of the content people are seeing on these feeds are about politics at all. Then we can dig deeper into this because we have these full cumulative distribution functions here. And so we can say that these, what we called an extreme echo chamber, these don't seem that common. Like only a fifth of people on Facebook are getting at least 3/4 of their content from politically like-minded sources. On the other hand, getting a lot of cross-cutting content seems pretty rare too, right? Only a third of people on Facebook have at least 25% of their content coming from cross-cutting sources. So definitely much more coming from politically like-minded sources, however you cut this. All right, so the observational evidence takeaways, right? Facebook does show signs of echo chambers and political segregation. And if some of you are familiar with my earlier work, I've definitely written some papers that have pushed back on the idea that everybody's in echo chambers. So I'll say, as a good Bayesian, from having done these studies, my prior on how much of an echo chamber there was on Facebook, at least in regard to news, has gone up a little bit from having done this work. So I've updated on this. So what does that mean? It means for news, a lot of news is primarily seen by those on the right or the left, but not both. And especially, did I not show you that? Oh yeah, I skipped this slide. This was the other, sorry, I glitched when I did it. This was the other thing, that third bullet point there. This asymmetric, this ideological segregation and exposure to news, it's not perfectly symmetrical. And in particular, there's an area of Facebook where most news is primarily seen by conservative viewers. So if you look at these things, these are not symmetrical. These are what Talia was talking about, the favorability score, the proportion seen by those on the right and those on the left. So it's not perfectly symmetrical. There's plenty of stuff that's primarily seen by liberals, by conservatives, but it's asymmetrical. There's more of this going on the right. And finally, people are exposed to much more content from politically like-minded sources than from cross-cutting sources. And then the big takeaway here, there's a complex relationship going on here between algorithms and human choice, which I think builds very nicely on the results Talia has shown you, which is like these are complex systems. And when we try to change minor things, we change things a little bit, they have unexpected, so there's a complex interaction going on here. All right. Now let's go to the causal experimental evidence, the big payoff that we're all been waiting for here, right? Which is, and to remind you again, we did 3 different experiments here. And we had this incredible chance here to take these scientific ideas that have been floating around about engagement maximizing algorithms, about virality, about echo chambers. And whereas previously, when we did work without the platforms, we could take people off Facebook entirely, but we never had the opportunity to explore these things individually. So what we privileged in these studies was going in and getting these best scientific evidence estimates we could, these clean estimates and clean takes at these concepts that everyone's been talking about for the last 10, 15 years. I mean, going back to Eli Pariser's book. And so we've got 3 experiments here. The algorithm to reverse chronological feed, no exposure to reshares, which is designed to reduce virality, and reduced exposure to content from like-minded sources, which is designed to get people in smaller echo chambers than they were previously. And the findings are that there was no impact of any of these experiments on levels of affective polarization, that's how much you dislike the other people, or ideological polarization, how polarized you were on issues. I'll show you the evidence really quickly. This comes from the first Guess It All paper with the reverse chronological feed, at the engagement maximizing algorithm, no impact on polarization. This is virality, looking at the exposure to reshared content. Again, we find no exposure, no impact. And finally, in like-minded sources, we find no impact. And when I say we find no impacts, Talia kind of glossed over this. We had like 23,000 people enrolled in these different experiments. So when we say no impact, these are very precisely estimated nulls. They're basically estimated at the level of 0.03 of a standard deviation, which is really orders of magnitude, smaller than we've had previously. So we feel very confident in these null effects. All right, so now, what can and can't we conclude on the basis of this? So there are, I think, a number of important caveats that I think we want to be really clear about here, right? The first is that these experiments, Talia mentioned earlier, were for 3 months. We changed people's experience for 3 months. The question is 3 months a long time? Now, I do political behavior and political science, where most of what I learned in graduate school was based on things that we had learned about University of Michigan undergraduates from being in a lab for an hour. So 3 months on a random people selected across the platform seems like a really long time for me. But it is possible that if we did this for a longer time, we'd get different findings. I'm also a comparativist by background, so I'm super interested in the second question. This was only in the United States. That doesn't mean we would see the same things in a parliamentary system. It doesn't mean we'd see the same things in a single-party regime. This was during a period of very heavy political exposure. Now, we did these studies because we came out of 2016 with a series of unanswered questions about the impact of social media in the context of the 2016 election that we will never know the answer to. So we very consciously designed this to rectify that problem so we wouldn't come out of 2020 in the same situation. But theoretically, we know these are periods of time when people are getting more exposure about politics. They're seeing ads on television, they're watching TV, they're more likely to be talking to their friends about the election. So there's a lot of sources of information. So it's an interesting question. What happens if we do this not during a campaign season? Another big thing to realize is that even if I was in the treatment group and didn't get exposure to reshares because I was being treated for that, Talia, my friend on Facebook, might not have been in the study in the first place, and she was still getting exposure to reshares. So we didn't do the opposite, which would have been a much bigger thing from other perspectives, of where we shut it off for everybody but kept a tiny control group of people on the platform. So we don't know what these things would be like if we shut it off for everybody. It's also, we privileged here, as I said a moment ago, we privileged getting at these scientific concepts in a precise surgical manner so we could really assess these theories that were out there. But that meant that we were changing one of these things. We didn't change all of them. And then the biggest question is, we changed this on one platform. Even the people, we were able to study 2 platforms, but we didn't have anyone enrolled simultaneously in a Facebook and Instagram study. So what if we could what if we change the engagement algorithm on every platform as opposed to just on one platform? We don't know. So what can we conclude? We can conclude that algorithmic changes affect platform experiences. Talia showed you lots of evidence in there. There's way more if you dig into these supplemental appendices. But we also learned that it does it in ways that you don't always expect. There was not a normatively good or bad answer to many of these things, right, when you looked at the things you think about. The second thing I think we can conclude now is that Facebook has a good deal of ideological segregation. A lot of news is conserved primarily by liberals or conservatives, but not both. This is driven, by the way, I didn't show you this results to try to finish on time, but it's driven by pages and groups, more about who by your friends are. And people are getting much more content from ideologically like-minded sources, although a lot of that content is not overtly political. But we can think about what that means from group behavior concepts with our social psychologist friends here. So finally, I think the big takeaway is we have not found simple answers for complex problems, right? I would have loved to stood here and said to you, hey, we did all this work, and we can tell you, if you shut down the engagement maximizing algorithm for 2 months before an election, people don't hate each other as much. It's not what we found, right? Unfortunately, we don't have a clear answer that we've gotten out of these things. Now, is this a reflection of the complex nature of the informational environment in the digital information era? So is this the fact that, like, no matter what we do, if we make a change on one platform to one thing, the whole thing has just gotten too big after all these years, that there is no simple answer out there to change, right? Is it also, and this is what I sort of call, and we have other work at the Center for Social Media and Politics, which is in this kind of vein, which I call the revenge of the political behavior, right? Like, it's really hard to change affective polarization, right? Like, these are not things that are simply changed. Like, there are some attitudes it's easy to change. Like, if I tell you about a policy issue you've never heard about, and then I show you some information about it, you might change your mind on it. Whether you dislike people from the other party, these are hard things to change. So is this just a reflection of how hard it is to shift attitudes around polarization? And do we have to, begin to think ask more difficult questions about this conversation? But I think that's our conclusion that we've come from here. What we cannot conclude, and this will be the last thing I will say, unfortunately, we can't answer the question everybody wants us to answer, which is, these experiments can't tell us anything about a world without social media. So everyone's like, oh, you found no effect on polarization. Does that mean that if computing power hadn't quadrupled or bazillion, whatever it went up by 15 years ago, and we didn't start getting these social media platforms, would we be in a better place? I don't know. Like, it's the wrong counterfactual. Like, we didn't rerun the world without social media for the last 15 years. We changed people's experiences on the platform. As Talia said, it got us to being able to look at potential policy interventions and see what the impact of them were, but we can't answer that question. And as I said a moment ago, unfortunately, we can't come here today to you with a neatly wrapped bundle and say, do this and things will be better. So thank you very much. We're looking forward to continuing the conversation, talking questions, talking with Jeff. So thanks so much for having us here today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Talia, Josh. That was just an amazing synthesis across such complicated and sophisticated work. We only have, 20 minutes, so I'm going to start with one question for them, but then I want to dive right into questions both here in the room and online since we have such a great crowd. The first one I want to say to you is sort of like, it's a bit obligatory because we're here at the Cyber Policy Center. You were really clear about like these levers that we tried are probably too simple. And then we match that with what Talia was saying, which is this idea that you can change things, but then humans change their behavior. If you were to come, and we do have a congressman here in the room, but if this was filled with Congress people, what would we be saying to them?
I think I would say that these studies, first thing I would say is that these studies suggest that simple solutions are just that. They're simple solutions that don't have the effect of curing everything. And I think that the world is a lot more complicated. So I think it urges a lot of caution in any policy prescriptions that involve, oh, we'll just switch off the algorithm, because there are negative consequences to that in addition to positive ones. And the second one is, I think that the nature of these studies, of being able to have access to data from the platforms, is so critical. And we were able to do this because Meta gave us permission to do this. But there's no guarantee that another platform is going to do this, or that Meta is going to do this the next time. So I think we need to think about what levers can be in place so that the public actually can have the information that they need, and policymakers for that matter, in order to understand what's happening on these platforms and what the effects are in causal ways.
Yeah, we need more research, said the academic. but it's true. There's two things that we've gotten out of this, right? The first thing is all the results, and we've tried to share them as in a concise way we can today. Dig into the appendices. Like we definitely know way more about what was happening in 2020 than we did in 2016. But there's a second order benefit of this, is that we came up with a system that allowed us to do this research and to do it in a way that it is rigorous, that it is replicable, that it is, at the highest, at the highest level of scientific research area. And that's now possible. And so platforms can no longer say that this is impossible to do. So if I have a chance to talk to policymakers, I would say, I want to know what's going on TikTok. I want to know what's going on Meta in 2024. I want to know what's going on outside of the country, right? Like, this was a first step. It was a big first step. It took a lot of effort to do it. And I wouldn't say that we have the perfect system, that there's nothing that could be improved upon by what we can do. There's lots of things we have ideas about what could be improved upon it. But like, to me, that's the policy answer. Look how much, look at what Talia was presenting earlier today about these unanticipated things. We need to know this, but we need to know this way more than we know it for just what we've learned from these particular studies. And so, to me, the policy implications are really clear. We need to think about how to do this kind of research much more often across more platforms. And to really emphasize what Talia said, this happened because Meta thought it was, for whatever reason, they thought it would be a good idea for it to happen. Is that what we want as polities of the country, of polities of other countries? Do we want the decisions of whether we, the public, get this knowledge, whether we learn scientifically what's happening on these platforms, to be up to the platforms themselves? Or do we want it to be part of decisions that's made by democratic polities through elected representatives? So that's what I would say to policymakers.
Right. So it's more of a policy around access in a way, and additional research. Great. We'll do one online one first, then we'll go to the room. This is from our colleague Ravi Iyer, and he has a question that sort of we've heard a couple times through several different people that came in during the social media and well-being kind of theme we've had. You have a lot of null effects. What would it take to convince either of you that these kinds of changes just will not have an effect? Versus, as you were saying, it's like, well, maybe 3 months isn't long enough, which is crazy because it's huge, bigger than anything else. Is there any evidence for you two that could convince you, like, maybe these things don't have the effect we're all worried about? Is there any way that it can get to that point?
I mean, my approach to doing research is to try to be really precise about what we've learned and what we've not learned. And so that's why I feel like it's, especially in charged an environment around social, I used to study like economic voting in Eastern Europe. You like never turned on the TV and had people talking about economic voting in Eastern Europe, right? So I think we have an obligation as scholars to caveat our work and to be precise about, what we have learned and what we haven't learned. That being said, I mean, these studies, we took the sort of prevailing theories of the moment. These were big issues. I mean, like, we said, the filter bubble, right? It's been around for over a decade now. We took these things, we rigorously subjected them to, in very high-powered experiments, did the field experiments. These weren't just lab experiments, we did these things. So yeah, I've updated on this. And I think, you know, we're all Bayesians, and so we all have to take what we had as our prior expectations, learn from more evidence. And it's not just these papers. There are other papers that are coming out that are, I think, pushing us in a direction of having to, you know, the way to be a good scientist is to be open to continually updating your beliefs on the basis of new evidence. And I think there's more and more evidence coming out that is suggesting that some of these, you know, received wisdoms that we've held about what make very logical claims may not hold when we look at them and we really try to tease this out. And that's what I was trying to get at the end there about various reasons why that may or may not be the case. But in my opinion, you know, like, and I think the danger is, right, the danger always is that when you are focusing on something that you think is a problem, and you're looking for explanations in the brightest, shiniest object in the room, is that you're neglecting other things, right, that might not, you know, and from my own personal take, like from your colleague Jonathan Rodden here and work by Ryan Enos, you know, like I'm more and more thinking about offline contributions to segregation, and particularly political segregation patterns in people's living. We've done some research at CSMAP, exploring the intersection between the online and offline dimensions. So yeah, I think we have to keep our minds open. I updated my priors on this a bit.
Great. Thanks, Josh. Feeling the same way there, Tyler. Okay, great. Thank you for that. Let's open up to questions in the room. Jeannie.
Thank you. Oh, great. Thank you so much for your work. You probably realize, I'm sure you realize this, that there's so much variability among the Facebook and the Instagram users, a variability in terms of political orientation, in terms of partisan animosity. And I was just wondering if there was any evidence, or if you had a chance to look at the possibility that some of the treatments may have been more effective for, let's say, people who are more moderate or less moderate.
Yeah, thank you for the great question. We did have many different heterogeneous treatments. Oh, sorry, people online. Mic is on. Thank you so much for the question. We did have a chance to look at a number of pre-specified heterogeneous treatment effects across these studies. And I think the interesting conclusion is in most instances, they're not significant. So most of these treatments occur irrespective of people's background characteristics, including political ideology, including their prior habits on the platform, including their age. So we tested a number of these, and definitely a healthy part of some supplemental appendices, because really the overall result is there were not differences there.
Yeah, crazy. Another one in the back over there, and then over to Tom.
Thank you. You shied away from saying anything about this a few minutes ago, so could I ask you directly, please, what do you think Meta's motivations were, particularly if the answer to that question is going to be important on future studies going forward?
I mean, I don't know what Meta's motivations were. I mean, I really don't. You know, I know there were people inside Meta, there were researchers inside who really wanted to conduct research, didn't want to be in the same situation as they were in 2016, where people didn't have answers to this. And those researchers came to believe that the research would be better if they collaborated in the way that we set up here. And somehow, that's what I know, right? Whether it also came from the top first, whether they convinced people going up the top. There are other people, I've made a huge point, we've made a huge point during this process of not trying to get inside the head of people at Meta. So I don't really know what the answer to that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I would add is that this certainly was in a context where all platforms were facing pressure from the public, from academics, and from policymakers to be more disclosive about data. So I don't know how much that factored into the decision-making that led to this project taking place, but that was the external context in which we were in 2020.
Great.
So two related questions or observations about the concern on this. It seems like the framing of the question and conclusion matter a lot, and you all have spoken to that. And one is to say, so algorithms are not causing this polarization or depolarization versus saying 3 months of a different algorithm doesn't solve the problem. And the first framing kind of lets tech off the hook. And the second framing says these solutions are too small for solving the problem. And while you all don't have control over the editors at the magazines and what they've printed, it does seem like the primary thrust in the media coverage on this has basically been don't blame social media, which does not feel like it's actually the conclusion of what the research shows. And so I'm curious about how you feel the the research has landed in public debate. And then I think related to that would be a bit of an observation that this feels like a study that's kind of based on an Aaron Sorkin world when we live in Karl Rove's world. The last 3 months of a debate, frankly, I don't really think people should be changing their minds that much in the last 3 months of a debate. Some notion that high-minded debate, people are going to engage across the aisle and realize your view of balancing the budget is really different than what I thought it was. That's not the politics we live in. So it seems like even the question that's being asked of what you would see as normatively positive in a world where elections now are primarily about turnout of base, unlikely voters, not about converting people, whether the premise itself is the right one for looking at the questions of polarization, the right timing. So that goes back into the same question, which is to what extent do you feel like this research, which is just unbelievable, unprecedented, is shining light in public debate, or places where you feel like it is distracting in the public debate?
Thank you for that. I'll get started on the first question, then we can add on to that. In terms of the media coverage of this, I think with any study of this nature, there's going to be variation in terms of how people interpret the findings. I was impressed with some of the media that they really dove into the nuance of the findings and the limitations, frankly, of the analysis that we were able to do. But certainly there is variation there, and I do think that you framed it nicely in terms of the two alternatives, and certainly I hope that we've conveyed in our presentation here that this was only done under a 3-month time period after social media had been in existence for a decade and a half, and these are tweaks to the algorithm that have been proposed. This is not the absence of social media altogether. So I think that that is the framing of the results that is most in keeping with what we found here. And then in terms of the second, thinking about, we live in highly polarized times, what are the expectations? Well, I think that there were legitimate questions about whether or not these things could affect people's polarization. It was a hard test. I definitely will grant that. But I think now we have the evidence to document and demonstrate that these sorts of solutions that were being proposed at the time, right? There were active discussions in Congress about should some of these things actually happen. I think that this is evidence of that. The only thing I would push back just a little bit on is some of the work that we've done at the Center for Media Engagement is thinking about, are there ways that you can use social media in pro-social ways? Are there ways that you can build connection? And I guess that I am more optimistic about the possibility in the future. I'll pass to Josh to add more.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's, as someone who's worked on polarization a bit, like, again, definitely, I mean, it's, there is this normative underpinning to affective, for those not familiar with the term, affective polarization is like how much you dislike supporters of the other party or the other politicians, and ideological polarization is how much your policies are spread. And there are debates about what's the optimal levels of ideological polarization. I mean, very famously, the American Political Science Association in 1950 in their annual thing called for more polarization in the country because there wasn't enough choice being given to voters at the time. But affective polarization tends to get tied up in this sort of it's normatively desirable to have lower levels of affective polarization because people want to live in a society where people don't dislike each other. But there are legitimate questions. I mean, and people ask this, and having worked in this area, you get pushback from people on this who say, look, if the positions of the other party are abhorrent, why should we not think that they're abhorrent? And so it's a complicated question, I think, in that regard. And I think that's why we very much try, I mean, and it loops back to your first thing about how it lands, but we try in these papers, ultimately, this was a project about doing scientific research, and there were scientific questions out there about whether these platforms were having these kinds of impacts and these specific features, virality, echo chambers, these things that we've been talking so much about in the thanks to Nate's articles and work as well on virality, right? I think that's number 2 on his list of 7. We wanted to try to test them, and so, putting them out there. On the final point, I'll just make one other point on your question about what are the right questions to be asking now. So we have done a lot of work at CSMAP, at the Center for Social Media and Politics, on testing different interventions, right? And particularly looking around things about people's ability to identify the veracity of news or affecting browsing habits and stuff like that. And often you're finding more and more of these null effects when you're looking across populations. And we have one paper in particular where we looked in the tails at the end of it, and this was about an intervention where we gave people NewsGuard that gave them a little green sign if they were going to a reputable source and a red sign if it didn't. And it had no effect across the population. But in the tails, it did, actually, with people who had the highest level of pre-treatment exposure to low-quality news sites, it did. And so I think there's, I've been talking a lot lately about the need for us as the field moves forward to think about tails-based research, that we can be in a world where actually when we do the kind of things we did here, and there are no population-level effects on affective polarization, that at the same respect, there can be small numbers of people that are in highly segregated environments, having a different experience from the average user. And what happens to those small numbers of users can actually end up being enormously consequential when it spills over to violence, when it spills over to anti-systemic behavior. And so I do think we want to, as we get to this point, if we're updating and thinking that, some of these things are not having the effects at the population level, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking at the effects in the tails.
Yeah, and I'll just, a lot of agreement from data here at Stanford on that, where it also feels our narrative to the population is this is a problem for everybody. And so everyone's has a lot of fear, distrust, when in fact most of them aren't really getting exposed to some of this problematic content, but there's a few people that aren't getting the help that they need. And part of this is a communication problem about how do we change the way we think about this. Great. All right, I'll end, sorry, Smee, go ahead, one last question.
I feel that one really important caveat that was missing from the list was that Facebook and Instagram in the 3 months prior to the US 2020 election were not operating the way that Facebook and Instagram would normally operate. So with the 60 to 70 break glass measures that were implemented that did things like buried things that had deep reshare chains, et cetera. So it was sort of martial law Facebook and martial law Instagram. I feel like that is a really important caveat because a lot of the results that you're showing that may have been null results may not have been null results if Facebook and Instagram had been operating normally during that time. So for example, when you look at removal of the reshare button or the chronological feed, there may be bigger differences if those platforms have been operating normally. So I feel like the caveat should be essentially it was the intervention versus martial law Facebook and martial law Instagram. And so I'm just kind of curious why that hasn't been a bigger caveat in the communication of the results of these studies. And then number two, more broadly than that, what lessons did you learn about how to communicate the caveats in the greater kind of public discourse around these studies?
Yeah, happy to get started. We certainly are, I hope, clear that this was in the context of what Facebook and Instagram were during that election period. I would, you know better than I think, but the normal Facebook, is that a thing? Our experience has been that there's lots and lots of changes and it's ever evolving on both platforms all the time. So this has to be understood in the context of how a platform will operate and did operate in the 2020 election. So we would absolutely grant that that's the case, that other things were happening in the environment, other things were happening on the platform during that point in time. And then in terms of communicating the caveats, I think we've just developed over time a clear sense that you have to be so upfront about what the caveats are because so many people are coming to this with priors of Facebook is really terrible and Instagram is great, or whatever their priors might be. That if they're not carefully thinking through this is what we learn and what we don't learn, they're actually drawing conclusions that may not be appropriate given the evidence that we're able to offer from these studies.
Great, thank you. We'll end with just one last kind of question. You can spitball or pass on if you want, but looking to the future, 2024 is the year of the election. Not only here in the US, there's 24 in Africa, Indian election. How do you now, seeing what you've seen, anticipating the future? Are you expecting this year to be similar to 2020? Do you anticipate a lot of changes? And if so, what are some things you're either excited about or worried about?
I'll say one thing I'm very worried about is the limitations of data access compared to where we were in 2020. We don't have access to the Twitter API by and large. Meta, to our knowledge, isn't doing this study again. We haven't heard of additional efforts at other platforms. So I'm very nervous about what our academic understanding is going to be going into an election that we really, really need to know these things. So that's my biggest fear at looking at 2024.
Thanks, Talia.
And I'll just reiterate the point I made before, which is that, you know, we did this in the United States. Like, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is how this plays out in countries, how a lot of these things play out in countries with less robustly developed media environments, right? And so, you know, when you talk about elections around the world, again, I really hope that people can look to these studies and say, wow, there's a method to try to understand what the impact of the platform is on politics in my country. Like, I'd like to know the answers to that question. How can we go about getting the answers to that question and those things? I mean, I want to be, you know, I want to be humble about the differences between the U.S. polity and other places. And we don't know if what we're finding here is generalizable outside of 2020 in the U.S. We don't know if it's generalizable outside of the political context of the U.S. However, as scientists, we know how to test whether things are generalizable, and that's called replication. And so, you know, we need to think about how are we going to, you know, this is exciting. We know more than we did before, but, you know, as Talia said, where's the action going forward now? And I think we hope that the model that we put forward here and the expertise that we and the people who participate in the study have generated, we're happy to talk to anybody who wants to try to set this up in another context about what we learned and what we would do differently and what to do. But like, it is going to be disappointing if this is a one-shot deal, and I think we need to build on this, and we need to, you know, see this as an opportunity for moving forward, as opposed to, you know, we did this once and that's done.
Right. Thank you both. And before I ask you to join me in thanking them, I want to highlight next week we have Moon De Chowdhury from from Georgia Tech, who's, in my view, one of the leading visionaries in thinking about social media and well-being, but in a way where you look at social media to help understand somebody's well-being rather than does social media affect their well-being. Fantastic person and work, and I hope you join us then. But join me now in thanking Talia and Josh for not only this talk, but in the great leadership in the field and this really amazing set of studies. Thank you so much for everything you've done. Thank you.